Welcome to ABCS Safety Training's Hazard Assessment course. In this course, we will discuss specific legislation along with industry-developed processes related to hazard assessment. You will discover why the single most important tool available to you and your employer is the hazard assessment process. We will use examples to assist in gaining a better understanding of the hazard assessment process, when the process needs to be completed, and why the process is necessary. Although the legislation discussed comes from Alberta, all provinces in Canada require that hazards must be identified and controlled. During our discussions of specific legislation, the term reasonable and practicable is used frequently. So what does reasonable and practicable actually mean? Or how can we interpret what is reasonable and practicable for each situation that occurs on a job? First, it's important to know that, like all laws, legislation can only be interpreted by the courts. What is reasonable and practicable to you might not seem reasonable or practicable to your co-worker. So, then, we must ask what the courts consider to be reasonable and practicable. This is where the industry standards come in. The courts will determine what is reasonable or practicable based on what the particular industry has determined it to be. So now the question becomes, how does industry determine what is reasonable and practicable? Employers have an obligation to either eliminate hazards or to control the hazards to a level that the chances of someone getting hurt are extremely unlikely. The controls that they put in place, unless specifically described in legislation, must be based on the industry standard. Industry standards are based on what is reasonable and practicable, or in simpler terms, what is doable and cost-effective. We will discuss this in further detail using various examples to help us get a better idea of how industry determines what is reasonable and practicable. The information will be presented in 5 modules. The first module is an introduction to the hazard assessment process. The next module covers job planning, or what we refer to as stop and think. The third module covers identifying the hazards. Next up is assessing the hazards. Then we will discuss controlling the hazards. And finally, resuming work. The hazard assessment process is a process of identifying, assessing, and controlling a condition or thing that may be dangerous to the health and safety of workers, may cause damage to the environment, may cause damage to equipment, or may cause a loss of production. The hazard assessment process can be broken down into 4 steps. Step 1 is stop and think. Step 2 is to identify the hazards. Step 3 is to assess the hazards. And finally, Step 4 is to control the hazards. The explanation of and importance of each of these steps will be explained in more detail. But first, let's explore the different types of hazard assessments. 2 common types of hazard assessments used by employers and workers are the Job Site Hazard Assessment, or JSHA, and the Field Level Hazard Assessment, or FLHA. Now, there are many names that an employer could assign to the different types, and there really is no limit on how many types of hazard assessments that an employer could implement. In this course, we are going to stick to the 2 basic types, the JSHA and the FLHA. The following is legislated in the Alberta OH&S Code, Part 2, Section 7.1. An employer must assess a work site and identify existing and potential hazards before work begins at the site or prior to the construction of a new work site. Section 7.2 further states that an employer must prepare a report of the results of a hazard assessment and the methods used to control or eliminate the hazards identified. This site-wide hazard assessment can be viewed as the Job Site Hazard Assessment, or JSHA. This is a huge task for large projects, or it may be very simple for small work sites. Either way, this hazard assessment must be documented so that they can demonstrate that all potential hazards have been identified and controlled. Legislation also states that an employer must involve affected workers in the hazard assessment, and in the control or the elimination of the hazards identified. On a large site, it would be almost impossible for an employer to be everywhere all the time. It is equally impossible to bring all employees together to be involved in an ever-changing JSHA. For these reasons, industry introduced what is known as the Field Level Hazard Assessment, or FLHA. The FLHA is conducted by an employee at the field level before the start of a particular task to ensure they are involved in the hazard assessment, informed of the hazards identified, and of the methods to control or eliminate them. The information provided on the forms usually includes a list of identified hazards contained in the JSHA that may affect the employee at the field level and allows for the identification of any additional hazards and controls that could be put into place. Another option that employers may use to ensure that workers are informed of the hazards identified and the methods to control or eliminate them is through safe work practices and procedures. A safe work practice can be viewed as a set of guidelines or do's and don'ts on how to complete a task. Safe work procedures can be viewed as a set of steps that a worker must follow to complete a specific task. Safe work practices and procedures are developed by employers through the hazard assessment process. Informing and requiring workers to follow safe work practices and procedures is often a more cost-effective way of ensuring that hazards have been identified and controlled. We discussed earlier that it is legislated that an employer must complete a hazard assessment prior to the construction of a new worksite. It is also legislated that an employer ensures that the hazard assessment is repeated at reasonable, practicable intervals to prevent the development of unsafe and unhealthy working conditions. It must also be repeated when a new work process is introduced, when a work process or operation changes, or before the construction of significant additions or alterations to a worksite. It is easy to identify when there is construction of a new site, or when there are significant additions or alterations to a worksite. But how do we identify the other times that a hazard assessment is necessary or must be repeated? Let's take a look at a few examples to help us interpret the requirements of the legislation. Let's say that your job, every day for 8 hours, is to assemble bikes at a manufacturer called ABCS. You only assemble one specific type of bike. It's the ABCS Speedster. Now, on the first day of your job, you had to go through an 8-hour orientation. In this orientation, your supervisor went through all of the company's policies, rules, and a bunch of safe work practices and procedures that you must follow. These safe work practices and procedures were created by ABCS through the initial job site hazard assessment and were updated using field-level hazard assessments completed by previous workers. Because you have been informed of the hazards that were identified and the methods that you must use to eliminate or control these hazards, at this point, you're pretty much good to go. In your job of assembling the ABCS Speedster, doing a hazard assessment at the start of each day is not reasonable or practicable. Since there is no construction of significant additions or alterations to your worksite, and there are no new work processes, and there are no changes to the work processes or operations, there is no legislated requirement to repeat the hazard assessment. It was more cost-effective for ABCS to inform you of their developed safe work practices and procedures than it was to have you repeat the hazard assessment process. This doesn't mean, however, that you never have to worry about conducting another hazard assessment. Because legislation states that it must be repeated at reasonable, practicable intervals, it must be repeated at some point to ensure that nothing has changed. Perhaps once a week or once a month would be reasonable and practicable in this situation. It is important to note that your employer's policies and rules may exceed what is legislated. If during your orientation with ABCS they informed you that you must perform a hazard assessment at the start of each day, then you must adhere to their requirement. Okay, let's keep going with your job at ABCS, assembling bikes. ABCS has now developed and is about to put into production the ABCS Turbo Speedster. It's really cool. It actually has a turbo. ABCS is very forward-thinking. But now the assembly of the bike has changed. You will have to use new parts and tools, and the assembly process has changed. At this point, because there is a change to your work process, the hazard assessment process will have to be repeated. In all likelihood, this hazard assessment could take place several times during the assembly to ensure that new hazards can be controlled. Once the hazards have been identified and controlled, then it may be cost-effective for ABCS to develop additional safe work practices and procedures to control the hazards.